Hi, this is Darren of The Draw on Zazzle.com and elsewhere. In this video, we are going to take an in-depth look at customizing an item from the Gatheron Kwanzaa Creations Kit, which is a collection of items, each of which has over 80 images available, which is to say, over 80 images that you can use as you wish, display or hide as you wish, to truly customize, to personalize, to create your own unique item for Kwanzaa. Of course, there's links in the description to the collection itself, to a catalog of the images available. I also did one video already that is more of a general overview of the collection and more basic editing and customizing that you might be interested in. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So what I want to do in this video is show the process that I went through to set up items like these from scratch. Now again, the point of the Kwanzaa Creations Kit is that you can take any of these items and you can make whatever changes you wish to, any changes you want to do to them to make them really truly your own, you and your family's own. But to help give you a really in-depth look at how to do that, all of the ins and outs, like I said, I want to go through and show the process that I use to actually set up these items from scratch. So for instance, consider this tile. So just a basic table setting. But if you were to go in to customize this, you would find that everything is more or less configured to go for that. So if you didn't like that or didn't want to use that Kinara, for instance, you could easily swap that out. If you wanted to change the background to, say, a different wall color, you could do that. Point being, as it went over and kind of explained in the overview video, it's fairly straightforward to begin doing just basic customizations. But on the other hand, consider this absolutely blank tile. So here we are in the design interface. The images are all here. However, this is how they are, or how they would appear if they were all just, had just been put on the item. Like you can see the backgrounds, they're mostly expanded, but they don't go all the way. They fit within the interface, but they're no bigger. Something like the draped Banderas. Obviously, these should be shrunk down so that they actually can fit on the table and appear to be a Bandera draped over the table. But here you see by default, as they appear, as Zazzle would place them, on the items, it's filling up practically the entire item, this entire tile. So that's obviously, not good. So point being that all of the items in the collection, had to be set up from scratch and had to be adjusted. So last time, like I said, I'm going to go through and show that process for the sake of really showing all the ins and outs of working in the design interface. Okay, so let's get started on that. So the Kente patterns, for instance, I mean, technically you could use them fully expanded, but typically I would go through and I would shrink them down, usually about seven times typically, maybe 8 or 9. It's all up to, what you think works best. So let's go here and tile. Depending on what you think, maybe those would be a little bit bigger, or maybe those would be a little bit too big yet. Maybe let's shrink it down a couple more times. Anyway, so I would just go through and I would get these all configured. And again, it's, up to what you think looks okay. Now let's look at. You might notice that appeared as if maybe it actually skipped over one there as I was clicking it to scale it down, to shrink it down. It almost looks as if it took a couple times. The design interface can be a little bit glitchy at times if you're trying to be precise, like in terms of shrinking or expanding something or moving something or whatnot. It might be helpful sometimes to just start over with the image. So like here, I'm going to go and fit it, which means I'm going to expand it so it's back again, contained, but expanded as it could be, but contained in the design area like it was. And I'm just going to begin again from there to shrink it down. So that's something when you're designing an item for yourself that you might run into. Again, that the design interface can be a little glitchy sometimes, and if it is, you can just start over with an image. Let me see if I can go ahead and get through these fairly quickly. And yeah, I should say too, the exact speed at which you click through, depending on how responsive the interface seems to be, can be helpful. Like here, I'm actually going through those pretty fast. But, okay. And of course you hide everything that you don't want. When I went through to set these up by default, I would tend to hide things as I went along, but whatever. Alright, so for instance, backgrounds, we want to obviously, you know, fully expand and cover the design area. So fill, we'll just go ahead and expand that all the way. Likewise for there. Of course, with something like these Banderas, you could perhaps shrink them down and use them smaller. They wouldn't have to be used as backgrounds. Let's see. And so for these Mkekas backgrounds, something I got into the habit of doing, again, you may or may not want to do the same. Depending on the item, I didn't necessarily want the edges to show. So for instance, this one, you see like this edge, it kind of looks like, you know, threads all around. I didn't necessarily want that to appear on a lot of items if I was using this as a background. So I would typically go and just expand until that was hidden. And you can see I clicked that, but it didn't seem to take. Let's go ahead and do that again to kind of reset it maybe. Okay. And especially if you're into doing keyboard shortcuts, you might find these especially useful. But either way, there are ways to, for instance, make smaller adjustments or larger adjustments than typical. So for instance, smaller moves, Alt plus arrow key. I'm actually on a Macintosh, so for me, I'm using the Command key, but you know, depending on your operating system, use the right key. So I'm going to hold down this key, and I'm going to expand that because I don't want to do a full expansion. I just want to do a couple of smaller ones to finish getting that out of the way and take the guidelines off temporarily. And I don't think I see any there. Maybe there's just a little bit. You know, if you look real here closely, there might just be a little bit. Maybe one more. Okay. Same thing for this one. Let's see. That usually seems to do, always seem to have done well with just one. But yeah, okay. And while I'm down here, I might point out something useful. This background here, this Kuumba background extended. You would think at first glance that this is just one unique, you know, background you can use, one unique pattern. Well, of course, you can have it fully expanded. You can shrink it down considerably and tile it to create, you know, a background like this. But something else you can do, which is not very evident, not very self-evident. Let's go ahead and bring up these grid lines here. Now you can take this and you can move it either halfway across the screen, you can move it halfway up. You can move it, you know, so it's only showing one quarter. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to hold down the Shift key now to do some larger jumps to try to get that to the center more quickly. Maybe some smaller ones here. Let's see. Okay, so now go to Tile. You get this, which looks pretty distinct from what the original, you know, appearance was. You could even scale that down just a little bit if you wanted to kind of add some stuff, you know, around the pattern. But the real point, as I said, is that you can do this to get different things. So you saw that with the green in the center. Let's say instead that we move it up to the top half. Now it looks like this. Now the red is primarily featured and it looks a little bit different. And as I said, we can even move it over both up and to the left or right. We can get something like this. So, you know, point being that you can actually manipulate this single image to get different patterns. Granted, very similar patterns, but nonetheless distinct patterns that even at first glance would look more different than they perhaps actually are. So I just wanted to kind of point that out. Let's see, go ahead, center that, fill it, get it off. Okay. Walls, of course, just go ahead and expand those. There are, of course, the 5 colors here you can pick from if you would prefer not to use either one. If you prefer a different color or you don't really care to use an actual wall image, you always have the option to go down and select a different background color. You can open up the color picker to, pick literally any color you want. Or, again, use one of the images. Now, these photos, or any photo for that matter, that you might add yourself. Well, I should say first with these photos that these images are a little bit smaller than most of the other images, which is to say lower resolution or less smaller dimension in pixels, less pixels. So depending on the item that you might be using these on, they may not be able to be expanded to cover the whole area or to be very large. Now, in the case of something like this tile, the design area is small enough, there's no problem. And then what we see is that these go into areas that may not even be printed, which is to say you might notice this green dotted line, this solid blue line, this red line. Strictly speaking, Zazzle advises that anything that you absolutely want to be sure gets printed, you don't want to get cut off, should be contained within these green lines. And so for that reason, it's always a good idea to shrink things down that you definitely want to be contained. Now, I will say in my personal experience with getting items from Zazzle and people, I've known that have gotten items from Zazzle, it seems like that the printing is usually pretty accurate. That usually is exactly centered, exactly how the item appears on screen is pretty much how you will get it. But again, that is Zazzle's official advice for that. You see over here in the guidelines, the safe line, the print line, the bleed line. And typically anything up to and including within the blue line, the print line is what should be printed. But again, if it doesn't quite print centered, something that's in this area between the red and the blue that normally would get cut off, it might appear. And therefore something like say this area got printed, then this area here between the green and the blue might get cut off. But again, just something to be aware of with these guidelines. If you definitely want something, have it within the green. All right, so for these words, I typically just went through and I usually would just shrink down this first one, Harambe, so that it was fully contained. And then from there, I would just try to shrink the others down to match. Of course, given that these were done by hand and were drawn, they're not an actual font, of course. But if you imagine that they are different fonts, they are in fact a little bit different. And so you will not find that a consistent number of, shrinkages or scaling downs, however you'd say that, will not always, it's not the same for each one. So if you're trying to get these to appear to be exactly the same, and notice add a little glitchy, I've clicked that a couple times and it didn't respond, just go ahead and fit it, start over. So you might find you need to do, different numbers to get them to be about the same size if that's what you're intending to do. I would often look at things like the A and Harambe and like the O here in this one. I would look for things like that to try to get them the same. Of course, so maybe you don't want them to be quite the same size, and that would be perfectly reasonable. That actually might be slightly bigger in that case, but it seems to look good. Anyway, let's just run through these. This one, Karamu, it seemed to be a little bit longer than some of the other ones, so it often could stay a little bit larger and look consistent, I found. Maybe something like that. Really, just what, looks good to you or what seems to work. Of course, you might very well shrink these down considerably to put several on an item, and then it wouldn't matter so much. Anyway, these tables, as I was going through setting up the items, I often found that the table did not need to be shrunk down at all, that it could typically stay as it was and just be moved. Now, I wouldn't say that you'll never have to shrink it down, especially if you're working on an item that's round or something and, you want to adjust it or something. Well, I mean, again, like I said, the items are all pre-configured by default. So in the case of the table settings and the tables and all that, they already will be at a size that that seem to me to be appropriate. Now, if you want to adjust that, you can. But anyway, for something like this, I would say, well, just move it down. So you always have the option to move something all the way up to the top, bottom, left, right, to one of the corners. Or you can use these arrow keys to move things around and, you know, just move things around, or click in the center to center them. Let's shrink it down. And as far as that whole like print line and bleed line and safe design area and everything goes, you might notice that I moved that all the way to the bottom. It moved it to the print line, which again, in my experience, typically is how the product will be printed. But if you absolutely wanted to be certain, you know, that you wouldn't end up with empty space like below here, it would actually be wise to move that down just a little bit to actually bring it down in line with the bleed line, the red line, which we'll go ahead and do. So let's go ahead and get these tables all set so we can move on. And again, like I said at the beginning, this is actually a somewhat tedious process to do all this that you absolutely do not have to do to customize one of the items for yourself, because a lot of this, like I said, is already pre-configured, and it's more about you making whatever little adjustments you want to make as opposed to having to go through all of this. But as far as the Kente spread is concerned, I typically found that if the tables had not been shrunk, then usually just one shrinking down of the Kente spread was fine. If the table was shrunk down at all, then maybe they know that didn't hold. And if you find yourself needing to reposition something like the Kente spread on a table, you might notice when let's see, okay, make sure that's the original size, okay, and shrunk down. What I would typically do is I would move it off to one side and then bring it down from there. I would try to get that lined up. Let's see, clearly too much. I'm going to move it up in smaller increments, and it seems pretty reasonable, I'd say. It hangs over just a little bit on the sides, but of course, a real, you know, spread or cloth or whatever you would call it, obviously it would have something, it has thickness to it, so obviously it would show over on the sides a little bit, so that's probably good. It does go over the back a little bit, and that could be an issue with the draped Banderas, as we'll see, but we'll work with that as we get to it. So the draped Banderas, I often found maybe 7, 8, 9 times was good enough. I think that was 7 I just did. Let's go ahead and move that down and see. No, clearly taking over too much in the end. So like I said, what I would do in that case, I would just go ahead and fit it again and then just shrink it down again. Let's try 8 times. And again, in the process, depending on how much customizing you might want to do, like on a table setting, you might need to go through like portions of this process. Let's see. I think that was actually, that's probably an example of, you know, being pretty good. It seems like the fold in the Bandera seems to match up with the edge of the table pretty well. It does extend over in the back a little bit. However, again, because there is thickness to the, you know, to the Bandera, you would expect it to be, you know, it wouldn't just, the end of it wouldn't just perfectly like match up with the end of the table. You'd expect it to go over a little bit. And as far as the Kente spread is concerned, you obviously don't want the Kente spread to show up behind the draped Bandera, because then it's, you know, it doesn't look like the Bandera is truly draped over the whole table. It's like it's just sitting there from the top forward. It does appear that with the Bandera extending back a little bit, the Kente spread is contained, so that looks pretty good. Now, I usually found that having the Kente spread off while I actually was moving it around was a good idea. And you might notice what I just did there. I had the Kente spread selected, and I went to move down, so I moved the Kente spread. Let's see about undoing that. You will notice the undo feature. It lets you undo hiding or showing images. It lets you undo reordering images. It lets you undo moving images. Basically, anything you've done at all, you can undo it. So we got that back. Go ahead and make sure now the Bandera is selected. Move that down. I think that's pretty good. And I should say again, although you don't have to go through this whole process, especially if you're playing around with trying to see how different things look or how different things are, you might find that depending on how, particular you are at having everything consistent, that you might want to go ahead and, like in the case of the Drape Bandera, if you weren't sure maybe which one you wanted to use, which one you thought might work best, you might actually want to adjust all of them to be the same before deciding which one to use. But, that is up to you. You could just do one by one, do one. If it turned out you didn't want to use that one, then you could do another one and adjust it. That's up to you. A little bit of lag there in the interface, you may have noticed. Again, that can happen sometimes. It can lag a little bit because of lagging sometimes. Things may not quite happen as you had, and told the program for that to do, and you may need to just sort of reset the image by fitting it to the area, like I've said. But that seems pretty good. Let's maybe take the Kente spread off for now. So the Nguzo Saba poster, again, I would typically have just shrunk it down by maybe 7, 8, 9 or so. And if you really want to be precise about placing it somewhere, especially say if you're working on an item that has multiple design areas and you want it to match, you can use these grid lines to help you accomplish that. Of course, otherwise that's not really necessary. It's up to you. And these 3 Bandera here are actually the same as the Bandera I have down here for the background. It's more a matter of convenience that the background ones are already fully expanded for a background, and these are smaller for a, as one of the symbols. Not to be used as a background, but to actually be like there is, the Bandera there. And so I typically would have just shrunk them down by 7, 8, 9, something like that. And I usually just move them up, again, by default. You can set it up however you wish, but by default I would typically have placed them somewhere where they looked, towards the top, not entirely, but towards the top. So let's get through those. So we can move on. Now, the Mkekas, typically, again, it's dependent on whether or not you shrunk the table and all that. And depending on whether you shrunk the table, you might find that you need to do some of the smaller, like shrinkages, not all full size. You might have to do some of the smaller ones, but let's see. Let's maybe go with 6 here. Go ahead and move that down. As you can see, it doesn't quite fit perfect, so I'm going to do a smaller move up. And I think that's acceptable. It's not obviously not quite centered between the back and the front. If you're really trying to get the Mkekas centered, and if you find that the movements, like using these, don't work, even with the keyboard shortcut to do smaller increments, if it doesn't seem to work, you do have the option to, click it and hold on to it, and just ever so slightly move your mouse in whatever direction you want to move it. And I do mean ever so slightly, because it will pick up on a kind of significant movement. Okay. All right, and that's actually even maybe perhaps a little bit more centered. So it seems to me that if you're, like I said, again, very slow with the mouse, very precise, but if you do make slight movements like click and drag, you can actually move it in smaller increments even than using these and keyboard shortcuts allow. So that's something to keep in mind. And let's go ahead and get this one in place. We could try doing that same trick here if we want. And I will say too, when you're dragging images like this, although it can be a little difficult to, well, there you saw what happened there. I was intending to drag it simply down, and it ended up being dragged slightly to the right as well. Let's undo that and start over. That's one thing you have to, watch out for. Try to drag the mouse precisely in the direction that you're wanting to move in. And look, I did it again. Okay, try this again. The good thing with this, you can always just undo and start over again if you want. All right. Okay, so enough of that. Maybe we'll leave that top one on there for now. And I often found it was helpful to go like to the Kinara at this point in setting up like a table setting, to go to the Kinaras. Again, you don't have to actually be setting things up from scratch. You're just adjusting what's already there. So that's not maybe as relevant to you, but. And with these, of course, you don't want them to look overly big for the table, but you don't want them to be overly small either. So let's see. That's 9 times down. And I think that looks like that's pretty good. Let's see about moving it down so it seems to be roughly centered, or even up a little bit on the Mkekas. Looks pretty good. And of course, in cases like this where you have images that are virtually identical, that are almost the same thing, you can always use one to kind of help you get the other one adjusted, to kind of get the other one to match. So both of those. Let's move through on these. Slight lag there, just to be sure. I'm going to go ahead and expand it and start over. And of course, you might see that there's 3 versions of the Kinara, and then each of those versions has a form with a gold candle. Of course, that's not really standard, but I have seen people that do that, given that gold is considered to be one of the Pan-African colors, along with, you know, the red, black, and green. Gold is sometimes thought of that because of its presence on the Ethiopian flag. So I thought that was a nice option that, you know, to have on there if you would like to use a gold candle instead. Anyway, let's go ahead and try to get through these. Get these finished off so we can move on. And done. And let's see, which one should we leave here for default? Let's go ahead and do this one because this is actually probably the hardest to work with the flames. Okay, so of course, if you want to have, you know, as if each of the, you know, candles are lit, the Mishuma are each lit, you can use these flames to accomplish that. You will see by their names, straight wick flame 1, I believe, 2, 3, and then slight right, slight left, strong left. Those are only meant as a, I guess you'd say, a guideline. You know, as long as each, you know, Mishuma that you put a flame on, there's no part of the wick that's like exposed, showing out of the side of the flame or something like that, you're fine. So those, like I said, it really, you can put each flame on whichever, you know, Mishuma, whichever candle that it works best on. The names are just kind of guidelines for which types of wick, you know, the flame might work best on. But all right, so let's go ahead. Now, I will say, if you do choose to put flames on a Kinara in one of your designs, the flames are one of the most tedious things to work with, and you'll probably see why in a moment. But let's go ahead and get started with that. So you'll notice by default, this is as expanded as it is because the flames are fairly small images. They're never going to be able to be really large on the design, which presumably is okay because they're only meant to be used on, you know, on the Mishuma. But let's go ahead. I'm going to hold down the Shift key and I'm going to do some. Okay, and there you see again, I clicked it. I held down the Shift key, I clicked, nothing happened. All right. And see, the thing is, now, if I do that again, it's possible that it might go ahead and apply both of them. And, you know, it all depends on how precise you care to be. The flames actually don't even have to be real precise, but if that does happen, go ahead and fit it. You'll see that Zazzle now puts a warning that the image will, it's larger than its original size. It might be blurry when it's produced. And I should say that as a customer, you have the option to make images as large as you want, even if Zazzle warns you that it might be blurry because it's too big. You can see how you think it looks, you know, in the design interface, especially if you're only expanding it slightly beyond, you know, what it should be. And Zazzle will allow you, it'll tell you about it, it'll warn you about it, but you will be allowed to go ahead and purchase the item with an image larger than it should be. Now, for me as a designer, I'm not allowed to expand an image beyond its size and then put that up and, you know, in the store. But as a customer, you can do that. But anyway, getting back to the flames here. So it seemed, you know, like it didn't take that first time. I was afraid that if I tried to shrink it a second time, it would have applied, you know, I wanted to kind of reset it. So I fit it. It's a little bit too big according to Zazzle's guidelines. So I'm just going to now shrink it down until that warning goes away. And presumably that's back to about how it was. So let's go ahead and start this again. Maybe that was 6 down. Let's see. Let's zoom in. Now, as far as zooming in goes, that's not really a feature that's in the design interface itself. That kind of depends on your browser and your operating system and all that. But yeah, let's see. Put that up there to look. That was 6. I'm actually going to go ahead and do a 7th on that. How does that look? Maybe a couple more. Okay. And I often found when working with the flames, it was helpful to have a background that they contrasted on somewhat. I found the gray wall to actually be one of the most helpful for that. So let's go ahead and do that. This is supposedly one of the straight wicks. Go ahead and shrink that down once more again. Okay. Might as well maybe, let's say, put it on this one. That looks about it. So to try to position these, just click it, hold, drag it down. Typically, well, I mean, you'll just have to kind of play around with it and see. Let's see how that worked. That looks actually pretty good. The flame might be just a little bit too low, perhaps. Let's go ahead and move on with some of the other ones, and we'll see about that. And how are we doing? We can kind of hold one close to the other to kind of compare in size, how they look. Like I said, these really don't have to be overly precise, so that's not a real big concern. And this one, you might notice it's still big enough that when you click it, there's a little bit of room between those boxes. There's a little line there you might see. You can kind of use that to help you see where it's going or not. Usually put that line a little bit further down than from where you want it. Okay, but now you see there, for instance, it's almost as if the flame is above the candle instead of right down to it, so that's probably not good. Which is where some of the tediousness comes in with these. Let's move that out of the way and just start over, bring it down again. And sometimes, well, okay, sometimes you'll click away and it'll still be highlighted like that. If that happens, you can just click it again and click away. We'll go with that for now. And as with everything, it kind of just comes down to personal preference, what you think looks good. I mean, I would say in general, you don't want the flame to be suspended somehow above the candle at all. You don't want it to necessarily be hanging down on the candle, though, and you don't want wick showing out on any side. So that's all things to kind of watch out for. And although that wick isn't exactly straight, let's go ahead and put that there. Okay. So slight right. Let's see. And what do we even have left here? I should say some of these higher flames I often found had to be shrunk down just a little bit more to roughly match up. But anyway, let's see what we got here. We actually have 3 right and 1 left. So slight right, slight left, strong right, strong left. They're obviously not going to match up perfectly as their names would suggest. But let's go ahead and see what works best. Okay, so slight right. Well, that one is probably not leaning far enough over to, you probably could just use slight left on it. You wouldn't need strong left. Let's see, and none of these rights are precisely what you might call slight right, but let's go ahead and put it on this one. And too high, drag it away, drag it back. Possible. We'll see how that works. And I should say that virtually every item in the collection, I did in fact go through and I scaled all these flames down, but the catch is that I did that obviously for one specific Kinara. So if it turns out that you would like to use another Kinara, the flames will be totally off and you'll have to make some adjustments to them yourself to get them matched up. Let's just go ahead and put the slight left over here on this one. Maybe a little bit too high. Put that down again. All right, that actually looks pretty good. And once I have all of these up, I'll go ahead and show you what it looks like when you switch to a different Kinara, just to kind of drive that point home. But strong right and strong left with, strong right and strong left with 2 right-leaning flames. So let's see, strong right, we'll go ahead and place it maybe on this one. Strong left, we'll put it on the other one. And like I said, again, the names are simply guidelines, and they really don't necessarily correspond well to like where the flame absolutely will not work. So there's variation with that. Nothing you have to be overly concerned about. I might put this slightly over towards the right since it is maybe more intended for a left-leaning wick. Okay, and you know, it all comes down to personal preference. If you think they look good or not, you can always kind of check to see if they seem to balance out symmetrically, like left to right, and how they look on the candles. Like I would say, for instance, that some of these are actually maybe just a little bit too far down on the candles. For instance, like this one, let's see. You can make a slight adjustment. And I'd say this Kinara is the hardest one to put these on, simply because these candles taper off at the tops. But yeah, of course, I'm not going to just keep playing around with this for this video. I said it's tedious, but like I said, this is giving you an idea if you have to make adjustments to the flames, what you might have to do. And again, here, of course, if we switch to the Kinara with the gold candle, it's the exact same form except for the difference in color of the candle, so that's no problem. But say we go to this Kinara, well, obviously now the flames are completely wrong. They're a little bit smaller than they probably should be for these candles, and in terms of where they're placed, they're all off. So again, if you go to switch to a different Kinara in a design that you're customizing and you want the flames, you'll have to adjust those. But yeah, a little bit of lag there in getting rid of that one, but gone. Okay. The Mazao, I typically found, let's see. Yeah, let's say I went through so fast with that, I'm not even sure if it took all those. I usually would do about 13, maybe 14, like, shrinkings. Let's see. And there it goes. As you can see, lagging. I click it to shrink it down, and it doesn't do it. Go ahead and just fit anyway to start over on that. That's actually 14. Of course, now that's shrunk down so much that it's actually behind the Kinara, so you might have problems even selecting it. In that case, as long as the Mazao is selected, just use 0 keys to kind of move it out of there so you can grab it and position it however you'd like. Of course, again, the idea is to try to get it where it looks to be on scale with the Kinara and the rest of the items on the table, so you can, you know, work with that as, you know, you see fit. And I will say that the second variation of the Mazao, a little bit paradoxical to work with because it has more Mazao, it has more fruit in the basket than the other form. So in that sense, you wouldn't want to shrink it down too small, but at the same time, because of its shape, it has a tendency to overlap off the table, which you don't really want either. For instance, that it looks like it's just not really sized right for it. So you kind of have to strike a trade-off between shrinking these down enough that they seem to fit without it, you know, without making the fruit look overly small. And I'm not even quite sure there how many times I shrunk that down, so I'm just kind of going to eye it, which, you know, you can always do. Let's see. I think that's about right. You can put them, you can do something like that where you put images together to look. You can actually place them and see how they look mirrored from each other. I think those look to be the same size now. Of course, you probably would not want to put 2 baskets of Mazao in a design, but if you did, you know, and you want to get them the same, that's how you could do it. The books, so the Zawadi, specifically the books here, maybe about, again, maybe about 14 times down or so. Again, you don't want these to look too big sitting on the table, but you don't want them to look overly small either, so bring that over here so it won't get hidden behind that. Let's go ahead and these, so like these, you can even set them up directly mirrored to see how they look. All right. As for the standing book, that one's a little trickier to scale down to be the same because of the different perspective. Let's see. Let's actually get rid of that on top. And I often found that unless I went into doing the smaller, like incremental, like shrinkings, that it was hard to get it to be what looked to be precise. But let's see. Like there, I'd be tempted to say that that is the same size, but I'm also tempted to say that it looks as if it's just a little bit smaller, so I would often leave them at what I thought technically may have been just a bit larger, but still somehow felt better. But that's up to you. And of course, say you were wanting to lean that against the Mazao, because typically you would either lean it against the Mazao or against the djembe, the drum. You could lean it against the kinara, although having a book near flames in real life wouldn't be necessarily the safest idea. Of course, as I mentioned in the overview video, because images that appear higher will cover ones that are lower, here we see that the Mazao is above the book, so it doesn't seem to make sense on the way this is happening. The Mazao is appearing in front of the book, so you would have to readjust that a little bit, reorder that a little bit to fix that. And let's see. Again, all up to you in a case like this, just how you want to position it, how you think it looks most natural. Maybe something like that. Okay, let's actually leave that there. Same thing with the djembe. You want to get it shrunk down enough that it, doesn't seem overly large, but presumably you don't want it to be overly small either, so maybe something like that. Have it positioned on the table wherever you want. Yeah, something like that, simple enough. And let's actually leave that there because there's really nothing else on that side of the table for now, at least. So let's actually leave that. Go ahead and take care of the Kikomocha mojas. These have to be shrunk down considerably. I would often do like 15, 16, 17. And there again, you see a little bit of lag. Again, depending on how precise you want to be, if you see that, you might want to just reset it by going to fit and just start over. But maybe be a little bit slower with applying the clicks to try to help it keep up. And that should have been 17 or so. That looks about, looks good. Looks to be about appropriately sized. Maybe actually just a little bit, well, maybe a little bit too large yet. Although, I don't know. Comes down to personal preference, but just a little bit higher than the base of the kinara. Maybe that's fine. Do the same thing with this one. Let's see. And because these are different designs, you may find they don't have to be shrunk down exactly the same. Let me reset that so I can count that precisely. Let's see. $17, okay. But you might think, well, or you might see that and think, well, it actually, I shrunk that down as much as I did the black Kikomocha moja, but you might look at that and think, well, maybe that actually looks like it's too small in relation to the other. Again, not that you would presumably have both of these on a table setting at once, but still, let's actually expand that by 1. Yeah, maybe about 1's enough. Yeah. And we'll go ahead and leave that there. Now, as for the Vibunzi, there are 3 different basic forms. Each of those 3 appear mirrored, so with the shuck either to the left or the right, and then there's 2 copies of each of those, so you get 12 altogether to work with. Now, by default, because every item, when I was setting it up, even if I ultimately configured something different than a table setting, in fact, I always, or I should say almost virtually always, I can't say there may not be like one item or one design area that, if a table setting didn't really seem like it would work very well, I didn't do it. But virtually all of the items, all of the design areas on the items, by default, I did set up a table setting before perhaps hiding it all, taking it all away to set up something else. So you should find that if you want to do a table setting on an item that doesn't already have it, again, that the images should already be configured in a way that's convenient, that you just need to adjust a little bit. So as for the Vibunzi, I always would have put 2 on the table and the other ones would have been up here somewhere. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to hold down the shift key to do large moves because, when I go through small ones. When I actually did all these myself, I actually did do the smaller moves, and I'm not even sure why, because it's definitely a little more time consuming and not as convenient. So that was 3 large and 2 small. Let's go ahead and start getting through these. And You might find that the yellow and the red Vibunzi are slightly larger by default. The images themselves are slightly larger, and so you may want to shrink them down or adjust them just a little bit more than you do the blue ones. I mean, of course, that's up to you. After all, I mean, you wouldn't expect real-life Vibunzi, real-life ears of corn to be, you know, consistently sized, so you may, you know, not want to do that, but that's up to you. And those seem to match. Let's see. And of course, when I say smaller ones, I don't mean the ones that are really smaller. Let's see, are those the same size? Look at those. I guess they are. Again, you can always compare images side by side to try to get them the same. Sometimes your eyes might be able to deceive you a little bit, but yeah, those look fine. And I should say with the Vibunzi as well, there is a feature for creating duplicates of images that are available in the design area. So, in other words, you are not, you know, for the images that are, you know, here by default, you are not confined to just using those images and not using, you know, to the images that are in here and you only have one copy, say, or only 2 copies or whatnot. You are not limited to just those 1 or 2 copies. You can actually make as many duplicates as you wish. So in the case of the Vibunzi, for instance, if you really wanted to use a certain one or certain one several times, more times than 2, for the 2 copies of each, it would appear by default. You know, you can absolutely do that. And I will show that just once I get these all shrunk down and in place. Let's see. All right. So, let's see. So you could do, I don't know, let's see which ones you want to do here. These actually look, let's try something here by default. I was going to say they almost looked a little bit big, but maybe they're okay. You can always go back, of course, and make further adjustments if you need to, but let's move this Kuumba over just a little bit, and let's see. Maybe, in fact, maybe move those over. Say you were happy with how these 2 images were in relation to each other. Whichever key, again, depending on your operating system, whichever key you would use to select multiple items at once. On a Macintosh, I'm using the Command key to do that. You can actually select 2 images at once and move them as a unit. So again, if you want to preserve their relationship to each other, but you want to get them both moved, well, both of them, 3 of them, 4, however many you have, you can do that. So I don't want that to be too far off the edge of the table, but I'm just getting some room here for the Vibunzi. Let's see. You would want the one in, you know, in front lower here to actually appear to be in front. So let me see. Let's say we go with this one to appear in front. Let's see. Okay. Maybe something like that. And let's say you wanted to do this one behind it, so it appears lower in the list of available images, so it's going to appear as though it's sitting behind that, which we want. Maybe put it up just a little bit. Okay, maybe something like that. Go ahead and hide these. And again, I should say, by default, you will find that there will be 2 Vibunzi down around the table, and the rest will be all up here, typically. Unless it was a design that by default I use the Vibunzi in some other capacity, then, you know, that may not hold true. But let's go ahead and start taking these off. And there we go. I said I managed to take off that one as well, so let's bring that back. But like I said, well, let's show a couple things here. First, as I went over in the overview, you do have the option to angle or rotate images. So say you wanted this Vibunzi you wanted to put a 3rd Vibunzi on here, and you wanted this one to be rotated slightly. Let's see, 15 maybe. We want it to appear like it's over the table a little bit, kind of angled on the table a little bit. That seems appropriate enough. And because this appears above the djembe but below the Kikombe cha umoja in the list of images, it actually works out pretty well. It's like it's going right between them. You do have some limitations in terms of this. If you bring this down too low, it's going to be like the Kikombe cha umoja sitting on top of it. And yet, I mean, you could move the Vibunzi above it to fix that, but then you'd have to be concerned about parts of it maybe appearing above the, the upper portion. So, you have to kind of, watch things like that. You do have great flexibility in how you set up things, but you may need to watch out for something like that. I think that looks pretty good. Is it, I was going to say, is it clear of the Kinara base? You'd maybe have to move the Kinara above or below it, depending on, how that looks. But I think that's okay. But let's say, though, you did not want to use these 3 Vibunzi. Let's say you wanted to do 3 of the, let's say the yellow one, all right there in front of the table. So let's see. You do have 2 copies by default that you can use. So let's go ahead and bring up the second copy. Which one? All right, so this is the one that's going to appear in front. That's fine. Let's go ahead and bring this down. And let's say now you want to do a 3rd copy. So look here in the shortcuts. Amazingly enough, there's no other way I know of except a shortcut to even do this. Hold down the Alt key, drag, and get your duplicate. So I'm going to, okay, so I've got this Vibunzi selected. I'm holding down Alt. On Macintosh, it's actually Option, but although it does have Alt printed on it. But yeah, so I'm going to drag it. And there we go. A duplicate of the image, which should be deposited up here at the top. You wouldn't necessarily have to, but I'm going to go ahead and bring this down so it's, better placed. In fact, my goal is I want this to sit like it's in between these 2, so therefore I want it to be partially obscured by this one, but, not obscured by this one up here. So I want it to be in between those 2. And bring it down. A little bit too low. Bring it up a little bit. And I think I moved one. When you start putting things close together like this, of course you're going to run into problems with overlap. In fact, let's get that out of the way and just try to redo that. Maybe something like that. I think that would work. You can kind of see that there's 3 there at the end, the one sitting kind of in between the other 2. So you can do something like that. I said you do have to watch when you get images that are practically on top of each other that you may have problems selecting the one you want to work with. You can always go over and click whichever one you want from the list, definitely. If you go in to actually drag it and you find that it's overlapping too much, you can always use the arrow keys to kind of move it out of the way so you can grab a hold of it, maybe take it up somewhere like at the top or wherever, a clear space, and then bring it back down. You can always do something like that. You can always hit undo to move something back to a neutral position to try to reposition if you have to. So again, just if you find that you have overlapping images and they're hard to maneuver, that's how you can kind of get around that. And finally, I think we went through almost all of this. As for the Kente strips, they work very well as borders. Of course, you can always use them for some additional adornment on an item, especially because you can create duplicates of them. You can even use them extensively for that purpose, but they do work well for borders. So we're going to go ahead and put these. Now, again, moving all the way to the top, bottom, left to right, Zazzle may not put it all the way to the bleed line, and again, according to the preview of the item, that looks fine. But again, if it would happen to, cut off, like say, this area down here, and it does print this area in between the blue and the red, that would leave you with a border that didn't quite go to the edge. So by default, at least, depending on the item, I tended to, if they're, well, I'll show you. So I moved that up so it's against the bleed line. Now, if this does print the way it's expected to, part of this strip is cut off. Now, is that a problem? Maybe or maybe not. Depends, how you feel about it. But typically, by default, if there was only a very small amount that was going to be cut off by moving it to the bleed line, I went ahead and set it up like that. For items, though, where it was substantially more, I left it at the print line and just figured, well, it just wasn't, in cases like that, I felt like, well, it just wasn't really a good idea probably to put it up to the bleed line, because more than likely it would print centered and then too much of the border would be gone. But yeah, something like that. And I suppose that is about it. So as you've seen, going through the whole process of setting up from scratch is definitely a little bit tedious, but I hope though that this helped to, perhaps give you a better idea, to better show you all the ins and outs of what you can do. I think the overview is a little more concise and, not so tedious and so specific, but you may have gleaned something helpful from this. I should probably go back and say how to add text in your own images and all that, just kind of recap that from the overview. So add text, type whatever you want, the check mark if you're okay with it. Zazzle will deposit it in the list of images and text and everything. It'll be at the top. It'll be in the center. You can move it around as you wish. You can always edit the text here if you need to. You can go here and you can pick from several different fonts. Zazzle more than once has added additional fonts that you have available. So it's almost so many that it's hard to even look through all of them. Of course, they do have some categories that help break it down. But yeah, text size. Have the text highlighted, click here, and you can access, again, the color picker. If you want to pick from any of innumerable, literally hundreds, thousands of colors for the text, you can do that there. You can have text that's curved. If you do that, this number, I don't know what it technically corresponds to, but it lets you either make the text more or less curved. So you got that. Vertical text if you want it. Character spacing, you can make it appear wider by putting more space between the characters. Line spacing, let's see. Just put a line in there so we can actually see how this works. So line spacing, space out the lines more. But you got that. You get the idea. And of course, left, center, or right aligning. You can work with that as well. And if you want to add any of your own images, you can select from an image in your account, or you can upload your own. And if you do that, Zazzle will by default deposit it so it fills up as much of the design area as it can while still being contained within it. So, you'd have to go from there again and modify it to be appropriate. Let's say in this case it's meant to be like a poster or like a poster of a photo, on the wall. That looks pretty nice. But yeah, you can always go down here to change the image if you wish and all that. But yeah, like I said, I talked about all that in the overview video, so this is just kind of covering that again a little bit. But yeah, so tedious though it may have been, and I'm not sure how useful it was. If it was useful at all, then I hope and I'm glad that maybe it helped show you some more of the ins and outs of working with all these images, trying to get everything set up. But yeah, so I hope that was somewhat useful at least. And I am going to do a third video yet, hopefully a much shorter video than either this or the overview, that just gathers together some specific tips and advice, hopefully again concise, just kind of get some tips and advice together for working with these items. So yeah, hopefully maybe I'll see you there as well. Thank you, and for now, goodbye.